So I'm Kayla. I am a PhD student at the University of Warwick, not for much longer, but as of right now, I'm still a PhD student. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the hidden struggles, particularly for autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities. So this talk might be a little bit different from some of the previous talks. I'm an academic and researcher, so it's going to take a bit more of that academic approach. So kind of just to start off, why does this matter? As I'm sure many of you already know, anxiety disorders are very common across multiple different populations. In the general population, it's estimated that approximately 5% experience at least one anxiety disorder. And this goes up significantly when we start looking at autistic populations and people with intellectual disabilities. So it's estimated that approximately 20% of autistic people experience anxiety. This goes up to 22% in people with intellectual disabilities. And then if you look at people with rare genetic syndromes, this number can go up to 80%. And the reason I highlight the rare genetic syndromes is people with rare genetic syndromes often have intellectual disability, and many may also have an autism diagnosis. So, for example, Fragile X is one of the more common rare genetic syndromes behind Down syndrome. It is the leading genetic cause of autism and is the most inherited cause of intellectual disability. So, in addition to having intellectual disability and autism, they're also much more likely to have anxiety, and this can cause a lot of issues when trying to diagnose and formulate therapeutic and intervention options for anxiety. So when we think about anxiety generally within the general population, we're looking at things such as excessive fear or anxiety in relation to the situation. So if you are in a social situation, for example, and you're experiencing excessive amounts of fear or anxiety, these are the kind of things that we would typically look for in the general population, whether these symptoms occur for longer than 6 months, whether there's any type of avoidance behaviors that Naomi's kind of mentioned earlier in her talk, and whether there's significant distress and impairment, whether this is in the home environment, whether you can't go out into the community, or you're having trouble with school or work. These are the kind of things that we would typically look for in the general population. And another key feature is that the anxiety symptoms cannot be better explained by another condition. And as Naomi kind of mentioned earlier, this can be a problem for autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities due to something called diagnostic overshadowing, which I'll touch on a little later. But this is an issue because people with intellectual disabilities and autistic people will have symptoms of anxiety as part of their previous diagnosis. And it can be hard to differentiate what might be part of the autism diagnosis or intellectual disability and what might be part of a separate anxiety diagnosis. So again, just to kind of continue on what we'd expect in the general population, I'm just highlighting this so that we can kind of see the differences in autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities. Is people in the general population might present anxiety differently than what we might see in autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities. So in the general population, there might be more of those worrying thoughts. So like, what if this happens? What if that happens? There's more of that catastrophizing. That's something that we might not necessarily see in some autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities, especially those with more moderate to severe intellectual disabilities. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but they cannot necessarily always vocalize those thoughts. More physically, people might show restlessness, muscle tension, heart racing, sweating, those kind of things that you would typically expect when someone's anxious, as well as avoidance. So, whether they're avoiding the situation completely that makes them anxious, or whether there's cognitive avoidance. So, cognitive avoidance just meaning that they might try to distract themselves from whatever's making them feel anxious. So, for example, if you're watching the news and it makes you feel really anxious about what's going on in the world, you might try to avoid the situation by watching something else. And then oftentimes in the general population, they can verbally confirm that they're feeling anxious. I'm feeling nervous, I'm feeling anxious. And while there are autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities who can verbally confirm, that's not necessarily the case for everyone. It's particularly those who are nonverbal, they might not be able to necessarily express verbally that they're feeling anxious. So just to highlight how it might look a little differently in autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities, There might be an increase in repetitive behaviors, meltdowns, and challenging behaviors. So while these might occur as part of the autism or intellectual disability, there might be an increase in these behaviors. And there might be an increase in things like stimming, just as a way of self-soothing. So it might not be stimming as part of the autism diagnosis, but they might be stimming as a way of kind of self-soothing when they're in an anxious situation as well. Similarly to the general population, there is avoidance, which may look more like rigidity, so kind of freezing, withdrawing from the situation, or just completely shutting down. And they're also more likely to report somatic or physical symptoms rather than just saying, I'm anxious, I'm scared. They might complain more of like a stomach ache. There might be increase in pacing and fidgeting. There might be changes in their sleep and appetite behaviors. And there also might be an increased dependence on caregivers because there may be a regression in those adaptive behavior skills. So things that they might have been doing before, they might be less able to do when they're feeling anxious. So just to highlight what one situation might look like for autistic people or people with intellectual disabilities, this situation describes child, but it could be applicable to adults as well. So for example, if a parent takes their child to the park for a walk and their child's afraid of dogs. So if the child sees the dogs, then their heart rate might increase, they might feel tense and worried. And if they know they're going to the park where there might be dogs, they might become a bit more vigilant, looking for dogs at the park, kind of looking to see where there might be something that they're afraid of. As they get to the park and they encounter the dogs, they might become more scared and associate fear with the park, which means they may be more likely to refuse to go to the park or try to kind of pull their parents away from the park to get away from any dogs that might be nearby. And while this may temporarily relieve some of those anxiety symptoms, overall, it will actually increase anxiety because the child feels like they're less confident in being able to cope, and they're more likely to use these kind of avoidant behaviors to avoid dogs in the future, which means parents are more likely to avoid the park. And just as a note, just from speaking with a lot of parents of children and adults with Fragile X, this is often a case you'll kind of see where parents will remove and not go to the park because their child's afraid of dogs, for example, and they won't even realize all these modifications and changes that they've had to make to support their child. And kind of touching on what I've talked about earlier, there's a lot of diagnostic and clinical challenges when thinking about anxiety in people with intellectual disabilities and autistic people. As I mentioned, there's an overlap generally in autism, intellectual disability, and anxiety when we're thinking about those clinical characteristics. There may be an overlap which may exacerbate the core symptoms. So, for example, eye gaze avoidance. It is commonly associated with autism. It's also commonly associated with ADHD, and it can be associated with anxiety as well. And if you're looking at rare genetic syndromes, it is often a core feature of Fragile X, for example. And so these kind of symptoms, if they have co-occurring symptoms, can kind of make it more difficult to parse out whether a certain symptom is part of their original diagnosis or if it's part of anxiety. It can also just serve to make it worse. And as Naomi kind of mentioned, there's a thing called diagnostic overshadowing. So anxiety symptoms may be overlooked or misattributed to autism or intellectual disability. So, for example, they may be showing signs of anxiety that might be confused and kind of just thought of as, oh, that's just part of their autism diagnosis or that's just part of their intellectual disability diagnosis, when it actually it's anxiety. And another thing that Connor Kearns has kind of really looked at is that autistic people may show atypical presentations of anxiety, which are things that are not necessarily part of that DSM or ICD diagnosis of anxiety. So this can include things like unusual phobias. So there are autistic people who have phobias that might not be considered maybe more common, like fear of beards or toilet bowls, bathtubs, kind of just things like things you wouldn't necessarily expect, or like a microwave beeping. And there are also some of their fears and anxieties may be driven by changes in routine. So when they're in a situation that's not necessarily what they're used to. they might feel that increase of fear or anxiety. And they also feel more anxious when they're in a situation where there's just a sensory overload and there's just too much information to process. That also might make them feel a bit more anxious, which is something that you might not necessarily see in the general population. And kind of just broadly, autism and intellectual disabilities looks different from person to person. Kind of that saying, if you met one person with autism, then you met one person with autism. Everyone's going to present slightly differently. And that could depend on verbal and cognitive abilities. So people who are verbal may be able to verbally tell you that they're feeling anxious, whereas people who are nonverbal may have to rely more on behavioral or physiological or somatic expressions of fear and anxiety, because they might be less able to recognize and label their emotions. Age and gender can also have a significant impact on anxiety. Anxiety tends to increase with age. However, that might not necessarily be the case with autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities. And anxiety tends to be more common in women, but that could be kind of that cultural expectation, whereas women are more likely to report symptoms of anxiety compared to men. And then again, anxiety disorders can change vastly across the lifespan. So, separation anxiety disorder might be more common in younger children and less likely in adults, but that may change with people with intellectual disabilities since they often tend to spend more time at home with their parents and caregivers. That separation distress and anxiety could last longer into adolescence and adulthood. Additionally, there's just a lack of adapted tools, especially in research, but I would imagine in clinical work as well. Most of the anxiety measures, including the anxiety disorders interview schedule with the autism addendum, the anxiety scale for children in autism spectrum disorder, both scales that are used in research to look at anxiety in autistic people, they only include autistic people with either no or mild to moderate intellectual disability and fail to consider what anxiety may look like in autistic people with more moderate to profound intellectual disability. Again, there's very few anxiety measures that exist for people with intellectual disabilities. There's the ADAMS and recently the CLASP ID. Other than that, there's no real clinical measures that exist for people with intellectual disabilities, specifically with those with more the severe to profound. And just to kind of touch on some of Naomi's work a little bit that she's kind of mentioned earlier, but it serves so well to talk about here as well. There's just service and system barriers. This is in the UK, the US, and it sounds like it's just a global problem for clinicians worldwide. There's a lack of confidence and knowledge. There's long wait times, especially for assessments. And there's just a lack of personalized treatment or intervention approaches for autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities. So there are some support options out there. There's adapted cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, solution-focused therapy. But again, a lot of these need to be adapted specifically for people with intellectual disabilities, but adaptations also really need to be considered for autistic people too, especially given each individual person. There are some therapies that are designed specifically for autistic people, such as coping with uncertainty in everyday situations. This is a therapy that's designed to improve that intolerance of uncertainty or fears around change in autistic people, but this is specifically more designed for autistic people with no to mild intellectual disabilities. Again, there's some kind of environmental support, such as sensory adjustments, supporting parents and carers, as well as modifications that can be made in the home and school just to make kind of that anxiety a little bit better. And there's also some pharmaceutical options, the SSRIs and SNRIs. However, there's very limited knowledge about the effectiveness and side effects in autistic people, people with intellectual disabilities, and specifically people with rare genetic syndromes, just because their neurological systems are different. So there's really no research on how these pharmaceutical options may be different in those populations. And just to kind of highlight, there is some ongoing work on interventions for people with more moderate to profound intellectual disabilities with and without autism. There's the ladders and the Beams ID, which are both looking at more generalized anxiety, and then the spirit, which is looking at more of those specific phobias, so like fear of spiders, fear of dogs, things like that. Just to kind of summarize everything, anxiety is common, but it may be hidden in autism and intellectual disabilities due to diagnostic overshadowing, it may be more difficult to identify, even for parents and carers. But anxiety is really important to diagnose because it can have a significant impact on quality of life throughout infancy, childhood, into adulthood. It can affect school, work, relationships, and it's one of the things that parents report as a big problem for their families and their children. Presentations can differ, so it's important to have a broad assessment lens and kind of consider the symptoms within the diagnoses for each individual person. It's also important to consider that behaviors may signal underlying distress, which is why there's the behavior checklist, which is designed to help parents and carers just kind of look for different signs and symptoms that may be indicative of different conditions, including anxiety. And early recognition and adaptive support can make a big difference, especially if adaptations are considered. These are all kind of based on the UK, but hopefully the resources that I provide are kind of universal. There are clinical toolkits such as the NICE guidelines for especially the UK based, but from what I understand, they can be used globally. There are organizations that are designed to help support autistic people and their families, such as the National Autistic Society and Autistica. There are organizations such as Cerebra, which help support children with intellectual disabilities and rare genetic syndromes. There's Medics for Rare Diseases and also individual family support groups for different rare genetic syndromes. And I've included my emails here, but Naomi also has the PowerPoint if anyone wants a copy, because I've included a lot of resources there at the end. Thank you.